Alcohol has been a cornerstone of Western civilization for thousands of years. From the altars of our great cathedrals to the bargain bins of our corner shops, booze runs through the heart of our society, both cleansing and corroding that in its wake. It marks the coming of age, anniversaries, graduations, housewarmings, promotions, hatching, matching, dispatching, or simply the end of a hard day's work. It lays the foundations upon which we build our friendships and provides the environment in which we attempt to find love. For many, the consumption of alcohol can be a passion, an art, a treat, a comfort, an inspiration, a social lubricant, and a confidence builder. But for others, it can mean destruction of the body, addiction, destitution, anxiety, depression, a way to drown sorrows, a veil from reality, and an antidote to the world. We know today more than ever the dark sides of excessive consumption, and whether it be through government levies or Instagram hashtags, it seems our need to cut down on booze is never far from our conscience. In this episode, I'll be joined by Dru Jaeger, co-author of How to Be a Mindful Drinker and co-founder of Club Soda. Together, we take on mindfulness and its misconceptions, drinking culture in the age of isolation, alcohol's role in society, masculine identity, national identity, friendships, sexual consent, social anxiety, addiction, underage drinking, fad teetotalism, and a whole load more. I'm Harry Barter and you're listening to Barter in the Booth. Okay, so we are live. Dru, thank you so much for joining me on episode 2 of Barter in the Booth.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure to have you on. I dubbed my first guest the Neil Armstrong of the podcast, so thank you for being Buzz Aldrin.
Do you know, I think Buzz is cooler.
Yeah, I think so. I'd just like to start with asking you about really the origins of the book, How to Be a Mindful Drinker, and of Club Soda. Yeah. I know you've been involved in several health and well-being projects in the past, and what made you decide to turn your attention to alcohol?
Yeah, well, Club Soda was really born out of my friend Laura's experience of quitting drinking. She stopped drinking about 8 years ago. And at the time, she was looking for something basically, if she was going to treat her like a grown-up, where she could take a self-directed journey to fix the stuff that she knew that she needed to fix. And actually what she found about was, really hardcore NHS services for people who also had drug addiction, or there was AA meetings, which she never got on with, or there was dodgy hypnotherapy, but there was really nothing which was based in behaviour change science or that treated her like a grown-up, that she could make decisions for herself. So as we got talking and kind of like the aftermath of her having quit and kind of settling into life without alcohol, we started having a conversation about what we could do that would support people to change. And out of that discussion, Club Soda was born. You're right, my background, I've had a really kind of I've got the kind of CV of somebody who looks like they've made it up as they've gone along, to be honest. I've done all sorts of things, but I've worked in charities and communications. I've done health policy research. I've done life coaching. I've done this whole kind of array of stuff. And actually my very first thing that I did, as when I was 18 years old, is I worked as a volunteer support worker for people in alcohol and drug recovery. So I've got this, as I kind of look back, really everything that I've done has been preparation for being involved in Club Soda in some kind of way. But really I have to say for myself, when we started Club Soda, I was kind of approaching it as this is a health policy issue, that there aren't good solutions for people who want to cut down or quit drinking. So what can we make that might work? I never really considered when we started that it might have anything to do with me and my drinking. And actually, it was only when I got into the process of writing the book, How to Be a Mindful Drinker, that I actually started to reflect for myself on my own drinking habits and behaviours and what was working and what wasn't working for me. I would never have described myself as having a drinking problem or being a problem drinker. There were certainly times where I drank more than I wanted to, where I had, those kinds of hangovers that go on for days. I had kind of general trouble, but not in kind of an extreme way with drinking. And It was really in writing the book that it struck me that you don't have to hit rock bottom to want to change. Actually, if there's anything, this is the conclusion I came to for myself anyway, if there's anything about the patterns of your drinking behaviour that stopped working for you, then that's something that's worth fixing and addressing. And so really the book is about that. It's about how to go about paying attention to your drinking, paying attention to what works and what doesn't work for you, and then finding a way of change that supports you to live the kind of life that you want to lead. That's essentially what the book is about in summary.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting that when people think about kind of self-improvement or giving up drinking, they often imagine, well, I imagine kind of what you said, in that you think of really militant, going to rehab, hitting rock bottom. Mm-hmm. Or you think of the other side, which is sort of very patronizing, maybe religiously motivated AA kind of organizations.
Yeah.
And I thought that the subtitle of the book, which is Cut Down, Stop for a Bit or Quit, was really refreshing, because again, I think there's a lot of people out there, you see them on Instagram, people with rippling 8-packs who talk about, you should give up booze and start running Ironman marathons. Mm-hmm. And, they can be inspirational for a lot of people. But I think for just a normal person who maybe, is starting to get some bad hangovers and is maybe thinking about cutting down, it's really, really refreshing to see something that's more down to earth and not as extreme. It's not extreme teetotalism, and it's not completely rearrange your life or anything like that. So I think
absolutely,
you've struck an interesting middle ground.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really important to kind of say that from the outset, that there isn't one way to deal with problems about drinking, because drinking problems aren't one problem. So there is a range of people. There are people, who get themselves into really deep difficulty with alcohol and who become addicted to alcohol, for whom sobriety, long-term sobriety, is the only reasonable solution to that problem. If somebody had a hardcore problem with cocaine or heroin, nobody in their right mind would suggest to that person that moderation is the way forward. Do you know what I mean?
Just one ticket a week on a Sunday afternoon. If you've been good.
I know it's only the odd line after Sunday lunch, Do you know? So there are people who get themselves into really deep difficulty with alcohol for whom that is the way forward. But some of the challenge in all of this is actually about the way in which we as a society talk about drinking anyway. We've got people who fall into deep difficulty who we call alcoholics, and that isn't a word that we use in Club Soda, but that is a word that people use about people who have an addiction to alcohol. And then there's everyone else, as if like the world is divided into two separate camps. And of course, in like a normal grown-up adult world, there is this huge grey in the middle,
Yeah, everyone drinks, for a million different reasons to a million different levels. So I think that's really interesting. And actually, in preparing to speak to you, I have thought a little bit about myself and my own drinking habits. Mm-hmm. Again, I've definitely been guilty of being excessive. I was at university for 4 years. Had a pretty full-on social life, and I think maybe the reason I never confronted my excessive drinking is because I was basically terrified that if I spoke to a doctor or a counsellor, that they were basically going to turn around and say, you can never drink again. Yeah. Which for me, being someone in my early 20s who, plays sport and has, I love going out, and I have, I have a good social life. And the idea of someone turning around and basically saying, you need to completely stop this cold turkey was really terrifying.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's great that you're putting emphasis on not just quitting altogether, but also just cutting down, or maybe stopping for a short period of time, or even just reflecting a little bit more on how much you are consuming.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I guess to kind of kind of bring a bit of science to that. So there are very few long-term studies about how people change their drinking. You know, actually, most of the research in alcohol is focused on immediate and short-term change, because actually doing long-term studies is really difficult and expensive. But there is this really fascinating study which was done in Birmingham, which followed people who were, by their own admission, heavy drinkers, and followed them over 10 years to see what happened. Now, unsurprisingly, if you follow a group of heavy drinkers over 10 years, the majority of people don't change, right? So 70% of people in this study didn't really change their drinking very much over the course of 10 years. 10% of people found their own route to being completely alcohol free. What I find fascinating, though, is that 20% of people in this study, who at the beginning were heavy drinkers to the extent that alcohol services were interested in them, right? So they were drinking at hazardous levels. Over the course of 10 years, they became moderate drinkers who were drinking within the safe drinking guidelines. So at twice the rate that people were quitting, people were naturally finding a way to moderate their drinking. And for me, that kind of puts paid to the myth that if you have a severe drinking problem, that sobriety is the only answer. Because here's a population study which shows that twice as many people find moderation as find long-term sobriety. And then consider that not everyone is a heavy drinker for whom sobriety is going to be the only option anyway. It does suggest that there are lots of people who benefit from cutting down or taking breaks. And actually, you know, in terms of halting the progress of what can become a mounting problem, learning to take regular breaks is a really, really sensible idea. So one of the problems with alcohol as a substance in the way that we consume it is that our bodies begin to adjust to the level of alcohol that we're drinking. It's why, you know, and you'll know this from being at uni, your first night out, you know, and a couple of pints and you feel a bit drunk. 2 years later, you know, 8 and you're still standing. It's because your body has adjusted to the amount of alcohol that you're drinking. And actually having regular breaks from drinking, even if it's like a couple of nights off a week, helps to slow down your body's natural ability to acclimatize to the amount that you're drinking. So, you know, for anyone, whether you are thinking about, you know, thinking that there's anything you want to change about your drinking or not, you know, my strong advice is always take a couple of days off every now and again, you know, put some non-drinking days in your diary. It's a really sensible way. But yeah, you're right. There are as many ways of changing as there are people. And it's really important, you know, in Club Soda, we talk about changing your drinking your way. A lot of how you change depends on what you notice about what works and what doesn't work for you in your drinking habits. For some people, that's going to mean, you know, taking extended breaks. For other people, it's going to be about learning to drink on particular occasions and not in others. You know, people are going to approach this in all sorts of different ways. And in Club Soda, we encourage people to experiment and discover what works for them.
Yeah, and surely by nipping it in the bud earlier and encouraging people to think about this, you know, before it becomes a serious problem, you're going to avoid as many people getting to that rock bottom point where they're being admitted to hospital with, you know, liver cirrhosis, or they're being found face down in the street. And I think we do seem to have that idea in our culture that it's only ever time to change or to reflect on how we live when it becomes life-threatening, which I just think is such a dangerous way to look at your well-being and your living habits in general.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to say that's a particular issue for men. So when people look at studies about how and you know, okay, so we're delving into the world of gender stereotypes here, for which I apologise, but in kind of general terms, when people compare the way in which men and women approach health services, broadly speaking, women are much more likely to go to their doctor with a niggling complaint than men are. And broadly speaking, men are more likely to go when a health problem or a personal issue is beginning to have a real world impact on their quality of life. So generally men are going to seek help much, much later. And, you know, because the physical issues that come from drinking more than's good for you, because they can take decades to emerge, by the time you're beginning to feel the physical effects of it, you've actually may have done some significant damage. So it is worthwhile, you know, it is worthwhile, you're right, thinking early and thinking about this in terms of well-being and, broadly speaking, the kind of life that you want to live and the kind of role that you want alcohol to play in it. And for me, anyway, that's about making sure that when I drink, it's about adding value to life, not about taking it away. That's just a thing that I carry around in my head. You know, and if more of us did that more of the time, then yeah, we'd stop that kind of mounting, those mounting issues which emerge much later.
Yeah, I think that's very true about the difference between men and women. I think in general, you know, for obvious reasons, I think women tend to be a lot more in tune with their body and, you know, going to see health professionals. And I also think men, and this is myself included, can just be stubborn and very lazy. In that I definitely fall into that category, is that it takes a hell of a lot to make me go to a doctor. And that's with an obvious health complaint, like, you know, I can't stand up because my back's in agony. So it would take even more, you know, for someone like me to say go to a counsellor or you know, a mental health professional and say, look, I think I have a problem with alcohol, or you know, I think I have an addiction problem. It really would take a lot.
And we have to be clear that so we should be clear that most people don't need to do that. But also, I guess for people who might be listening to this who are kind of thinking, oh, fuck, that is me, I do need to talk to somebody, is actually to understand that your doctor or a mental health professional is there to support you and help you find a solution for you. You know, Harry, you mentioned this kind of idea that you're going to sit in front of a doctor and they're going to tell you to never drink again. I have to tell you, in my experience of the way in which doctors react to drinking problems, generally, they're going to tell you to cut down. You know, and
I think that's great, because I think that really is the obstacle to a lot of people who might think that they drink too much, is that they're so terrified that their whole social life is just going to be torn away from them, and that they're basically going to have to become a hermit and, you know, collect stamps for the rest of their life because they can never go to the pub, or they can, you know, they can never have a few beers with some mates.
I love the idea that I'm sorry, I love the idea you just drawn a Venn diagram where people who go to the pub and people who collect stamps are mutually exclusive groups. Angry pub-going stamp collectors everywhere want to complain to you. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, they are a core demographic of my listenership.
Obviously,
as well, so.
Obviously, yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting what you said about the age thing as well, because I think that's where alcohol can really come to bite you in the arse. Is that you know, like when I was at uni, I did consume a hell of a lot, but you know, I was playing a lot of sport. I was very active, and I could get away with it because I was young, and because I was living quite an active lifestyle, and I ate fairly well and stuff, and I could get away with it. And I think a lot of the time, alcohol is kind of a young man's game, or that's when the seed is sown, and it might not be until, you know, 40 years later that suddenly it starts to show its effects. Yeah.
I mean, certainly we find that in Club Soda. So we, as I say, we support people who want to change by cutting down or quit. We've actually grown a community around the world of more than 50,000 people over the past 5 years. You know, people who are committed to exploring and changing their relationship with alcohol. What we do find kind of broadly in our membership is that people tend to be over the age of 40, and there is something in that. You know, it does take a while, as you suggest, for drinking, which, you know, can be an amusing pastime for people in their 20s, actually begins to get in the way of life, you know, and kind of doing your job well and being there for your family and all of that stuff, and it can really start to hurt, and that's actually where where people start to drift into our membership, is at that kind of late 30s, early 40s stage, where people are going, no, this is becoming an issue, and it is something that I need to do something about.
And I think it's so easy to get into bad habits when you're young because you can get away with it. You don't have much responsibility. You might not have a serious job. You haven't got any kids. No one's depending on you, and you're not getting bad hangovers. You know, you feel healthy, and you feel like you're. It's not having an impact on your physical or mental health. So you get into those bad habits where, you know, going out and having 40 units of alcohol in one night is good fun. But the problem is that then, down the road when you're trying to break those habits, and suddenly you've got a serious job, you've got a family that you have to look after, you've got so much more responsibility. That's when those habits really do come back to ruin you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's really important. You mentioned about socializing, and I guess this idea that if you significantly cut down or you stop drinking altogether, that you basically need to call time on the idea of having a social life. And, you know, that might have been true 10 years ago, but actually one of the really kind of extraordinary things which has happened in the drinks industry over the past decade is that more and more brands have started to get their head around the fact that when people go out, or when they're buying drinks at home, that the alternative to alcohol doesn't have to be a children's soft drink. You know, the kind of, there used to be this thing, didn't there? You go to a pub and it was either, if you weren't going to have a beer, it was, you could have an apple ties or an orange juice. You know, and you know, unfortunately, the world's really
those neglected children in the pub sitting with a can of Coke and a curly whirly while their parents had, you know, 8 pints.
Fond memories. But you know, the world has really significantly moved on, and in Club Soda we do a lot of work with alcohol-free brands about the promotion and choice of low and no alcohol alternatives, and particularly for beer drinkers. Now in the UK, it's really rare to go into a pub and not find a decent alcohol-free beer behind the bar, you know, and the world has expanded beyond Beck's Blue. You know, there is a lot of choice available, and all of that is super helpful and useful, especially to people who want to cut down. So Nielsen, who do research on consumer behaviour, they did a really interesting study last year looking at purchases of alcohol-free beer in supermarkets, and the thing that they discovered is that the people who were buying alcohol-free beer most were also the people who were buying regular strength beer. You know, it's actually the biggest market for alcohol-free beer is people who are drinking regular full strength beer, you know. So having choice is a really important element of this, and that can actually support you to sustain a social life. So, you know, we're not living in a world where cutting down or stopping drinking means that you need to sit in a dusty church hall telling everyone how broken you are. You know, that's not the world that we're living in. You can still go out, you can have a good time with your mates, you can drink a lot less, or you can not drink at all, and you can still have a good time and be social. I mean, there's a whole load of stuff to unpack there about kind of the dynamics of socializing if you're drinking less or not at all. But, you know, it's not, we're not talking about that having an alcohol-free life or a life where alcohol is significantly reduced means that any chance for social life vanishes overnight, because it just doesn't.
And I think there's definitely been a resurgence, I think, at least in the last 5 years or maybe 10 years, about quality over quantity, in that more people seem to be drinking things like ale and things like gin. You know, you get all these pop-up, you know, hipster distilleries, and I think people, they actually give a shit about what they drink now, in terms of people would rather have, you know, a couple of good beers or some good gin or something that's been made locally. Then it's not about just, okay, I'm going to go to the pub and just have 10 pints of whatever piss they've got on tap there. And I think it's counterintuitive, but I think in some ways being more interested in alcohol and the culture, and being interested in things like brewing and distillation, can actually lead you to have a more healthy outlook on drinking, because like I said, you're worried about quality rather than quantity.
Yeah, I mean, so I just want to kind of sound a note of caution that is true for some people. It's not true for everyone. You know, there is a significant crowd of people in pubs who enjoy vast quantities of unchallenging lagers, and you know there will always be. But yeah, you're right. Particularly when it comes to craft beers and gins, small scale has really taken off. Actually, that's as true for alcohol-free versions as it is for beers with alcohol in. There are now craft brewers who specialise in making alcohol-free real ale. You know, so there is this enormous diversity. There are so many alcohol-free gin alternatives I can't begin to tell you. But you know, there is a huge amount of choice. And you're right, it is about paying attention to quality. Now, the note of caution that I want to sound on that is that in terms of pure alcohol content, your body reacts exactly the same to a unit of Peroni as it does to a unit of a
Frosty Jacks.
Exactly, you know, or to some kind of extraordinary microbrewery concoction. You know, the alcohol is still going to have the same effect on you. But actually, if you're somebody who's thinking about moderating their drinking, one of the tactics that you can use is actually to choose more difficult drinks. One of the reasons that people drink those kinds of unchallenging lagers, you know, those kind of mainstream brands, is because they're served super cold. And they are designed to be drunk quickly. And that when you think about things like fruit ciders and sweet white wines. Exactly, but you know, whether it's Copperberg or Chardonnay, actually, what people are consuming is the sugar as well as the alcohol, and your palate is designed basically, if it kind of runs across sugar, to consume more and more and more of it. It's we have this physiological response to sweet stuff that we want to consume it when we discover it, and so some of those drinks are designed to be drunk quickly. One of the ways, if you are thinking about cutting down or want to pay more attention to what you're drinking, is to switch to more complicated drinks. So whether that is kind of hoppier beers or drier wines or kind of more complex reds or more challenging spirits, that can be a really useful way of putting the brakes on. So you're not just necking vast quantities of booze, but you are choosing higher quality products.
Retraining your palate to enjoy more sort of sophisticated drinks.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, that's not to say you can't get in trouble drinking Lefroy in the same way that you can drinking Bell's. Of course you can.
Not.
You know, but actually, you know, as a tactic for slowing down, if you're somebody who is kind of moderating, thinking about quality can be a really useful thing to do. The other really useful thing to do, if you're somebody who's moderating and thinking about cutting down, is to pay attention to what your drink alternative is, because with the best will in the world, if you are swapping between a really good ale and a pint of Diet Coke, I can tell you that after the first Diet Coke, you're going to give up on the idea of alternating, right? So make sure that if you are somebody who's moderating their drinking and wants to cut down, and you're using drink swaps as a tactic for doing that, choose alcohol-free drinks that you actually enjoy. It sounds like the most obvious thing to say, but you wouldn't believe the number of people who think that lime and soda is the only alternative behind a bar. You know,
well, I think
there are lots and lots that you can choose, you know.
But to be honest, that was sort of the image that I have in my head of, you know, someone who's not drinking, again, is like sitting in the corner with an orange juice while everyone else is enjoying the, you know, whatever good ale they've got on rotation that day.
Yeah.
And I think what worries me as well is that feeling of exclusion, of missing out on something, because I am, and people that I'm friends with, we do enjoy sampling different beers or different spirits. That's part of the reason for going to different pubs. So the idea of not being able to partake in the sort of, it sounds pretentious, but maybe the connoisseurship of alcohol, I think that can be one big obstacle to people cutting down on their drinking.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess so. Going back to the kind of the idea that I carry around with myself about my own drinking. So I still drink. I drink very, very moderately. And my decision is always, is having a drink in this occasion going to add value to it? And it may be, if you've got a group of friends and you are, you're real ale fans, you've got a group of people, you visit a camera pub, you see what the latest ale is on rotation. If you're somebody who in that kind of scenario is thinking about cutting down, then you want to think about, where is alcohol adding value to my life? And it may be, for example, that you go, okay, so going out with my friends, going to real old pubs really does add value. But actually, there's this bit of drinking that I do on my own, at home, on a Friday night with a takeaway, which, to be honest, I could do without. Make the smart choice, right? Get rid of the bit of drinking which doesn't add any value to your life and hold on to the bit that does. So nobody in this is saying, and certainly I'm not saying, that there are certain occasions on which you should or shouldn't drink. The issue is, which of those occasions in your life serve to make life better? Some of them will, some of them won't. Get rid of the ones that don't. It's not complex to go, okay, if I want to drink on this occasion, I'm not going to drink on that occasion. And then just start to make reasonable choices about what works for you.
Yeah, that is something I've never really understood, is people that just have like a can of beer every night. And to be honest, I think that has been a way that I've possibly justified binge drinking, in that I'm saying that, I never drink during the week, I never drink alone, I never drink at home. So it's okay that I'm having 15 pints on a Saturday night and waking up in the gutter, which I know is not a good, it is not a good way to justify it. But yeah, I think that's good to think about your life. When are you using it for a social lubricant or as conversation, or when are you indulging in that sort of connoisseurship about alcohol, and when you are just doing it for the sake of it? Like they talk about it with obese people, don't they? The sort of unconscious eating, people that don't even know they're doing, they walk past the fridge and they grab something and eat it, and if you ask them to say what they'd eaten that day, they probably wouldn't include that. And I think some people are like that with drinking, in that every night, they crack open a can after work, and then that becomes 2 or 3, and before they know it, they're consuming real vast quantities of alcohol every week, and they're not even deriving any sort of pleasure or social interaction from it. And I also wonder, is we see in the UK, especially now with the lockdowns, pubs are just shutting down in in huge numbers. And back in the day, pubs used to be the only place you could get a drink, and they were sort of centres of the community. And I understand why giving up drinking would worry you, because if that is the centre of your world, the pub, then giving up drinking can seem like a mammoth task. But I wonder now, is that it's so easy now and so much cheaper to just buy alcohol in supermarkets, and I feel like more and more people are drinking at home rather than going to pubs or going to bars. I was just wondering how you feel that affects the style and the volume in which people drink. And also with the lockdown, that's being amplified even more, because people can't go out, so people are forced, basically, if they want to enjoy alcohol, to do it in their homes. And I wonder if, because you don't have the barriers of how, this is going to be really expensive for me, or the pub's only open at this time, getting into that habit of drinking at home basically means there's nothing to stop you just drinking huge amounts, any time of day, and almost being able to justify it, because you're saying, well, I'm not going to the pub, I'm not going to the bar, I'm just chilling out at home. So in a way, it doesn't sound as bad.
Yeah, so there's quite a lot to unpack there. I guess one of the things which is worth saying up front is that most of our alcohol consumption doesn't take place in pubs. Even before the pandemic and lockdown, and that, the shutting down of society in the UK that happened in March, and that initial closure of pubs, at that point in time, 2/3 of our drinking was already happening at home. So actually, we drink twice as much in our own homes than we ever do in pubs, bars and restaurants combined. That was already a trend, and the fact that local pubs were already closing suggests a kind of a longer term shift in our drinking habits away from socializing around alcohol towards drinking in the home.
It's just so much cheaper when you think now.
Yeah.
If you go to a pub and you want to have maybe 6 pints, you're looking at possibly paying 30, 40, 50 quid for the pleasure. But you can go and get a crate of 15 cans for $9.99, or you can go and buy a bottle of vodka for a tenner, and sit in your living room or sit in your kitchen with your friends. And again, there's no obstacles to it becoming excessive, because there's no, you can have a house party that can go on till 6 a.m. if you wanted to, and with 24-hour supermarkets, there's just no limit to how much you can consume and how often you can consume it.
That may be true. Actually, though, I want to kind of push back a little bit on that assumption about how it is that people drink in their homes. I mean, so really interestingly, when you look at the stats about, there's two ways of looking at this. One is about what people report in terms of what their drinking is like, and then the other is looking at alcohol sales. So in the UK, we actually track the volume of alcohol sold from supermarkets and pubs. And the really interesting thing, although when the pubs closed back in March, although people did start buying more alcohol from supermarkets, there was, where as people were kind of stockpiling loo roll and pasta and flour, they were also stockpiling cans of Stella. It wasn't going to disappear.
It makes perfect sense to me.
Perfect sense.
I'd be first. I would have been first in the queue. There's there's alternatives to loo roll, but there's no alternative to a nice can of Stella.
That's very true. So, but even with the increased amount of alcohol that people were buying in supermarkets during that period of the first lockdown, it was nowhere close to the amount of alcohol that had previously been sold in pubs, bars and restaurants. You actually had the situation where pubs were pouring away beer because there was no way to get it to consumers, and brewers were actually finding that their overall production shrank during that period because they couldn't divert the pub stocks to retail. So the overall amount that we bought of alcohol during lockdown actually went down. The story that goes around is that people drank more in lockdown, and for a portion of the population, that is absolutely true. So one of the reasons that we drink, and sometimes that we drink more than we want to, is as a way of coping with difficult and big emotions. And particularly if you're feeling stressed, or if you're struggling to cope, or if you're angry and frustrated, having a drink can be a way in which people deal with it. And there is a portion of the population, about 20% of the population, who consistently report that they've been drinking more during lockdown, sometimes a lot more. And those people who sometimes they'd wait until the kids were in bed before they had a glass of wine, slowly pulling that forward to 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And before you know it, you're opening a bottle of wine at lunchtime.
It's mummy's Ribena.
Exactly. There are people for whom wine o'clock got earlier and earlier in the day. There is that portion. But there's actually a bigger portion of people who say that they're drinking the same amount or less or not at all. There's particularly for those of us who are social drinkers. I actually want to go back to your, the going out with your mates kind of drinking. If you were the kind of person who would happily go out with their mates and before you know it, a couple of hours have passed and you're 6 pints down, I'd be willing to bet that you wouldn't sit at your kitchen table on your own and drink that quantity of alcohol because it's just not fun. It doesn't come with the same social interaction with your friends, So for lots of social drinkers, for people whose drinking centred around the pub and centred around going out with their mates, actually lockdown has provided an opportunity to take a natural break because those people haven't, and the sales figures bear this out, people didn't bring their social drinking home with them. If you were an after work social drinker. You know, if you were the kind of person who on a Thursday, Friday night would kind of roll out of the office and into a pub with your workmates. People have tried doing that on Zoom, but to be honest, after an hour and a half of looking at your colleagues on a screen, having spent all day looking, people have had enough, you know. So people just aren't, particularly social drinkers, just haven't been drinking in the same way during lockdown. It's people who were already at-home drinkers for whom all of the circumstances around at-home drinking have become amplified, and because that's such a hidden problem anyway, you know, it's not something that people advertise to their friends. You know, it's those people who, if we're going to be concerned about anyone in lockdown, it should be at-home drinkers for whom all of the triggers and controls around a lockdown or at-home drinking have got out of hand. It's those people who are potentially getting themselves into some deep trouble.
And also, I definitely think that subconsciously I use alcohol on a kind of reward basis. In that on a Friday afternoon, I do quite often get the hankering to go to the pub or meet up with a few mates, go for a boozy dinner, because I feel like, I deserve it, because, you know, I've had a tough week, I've worked all week, I've been good, I've eaten well, I've been active, so you know what, it's Friday night, why not? I'm going to go to the bar and have some drinks. And I guess when you're working from home, or when you're kind of sat twiddling your thumbs, it's not triggering that kind of reward reflex that you feel like, now it's time for a drink because I've achieved XYZ. If you've sat around doing bugger all day, then I kind of feel like, well, I don't really deserve a drink.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting, isn't it? You know, the extent to which we use alcohol as a reward. You know, we are so conditioned by our society to suggest that any celebration, any achievement is going to be enhanced with alcohol. You know, that is, so many of us just take that for granted, that actually we forget that we can mark our achievements in different ways. There are other ways of rewarding ourselves. What we're after is a dopamine hit, actually. You know, it's like we're little kids and we want somebody to pat us on the head and say, well done, you know, and we can get that in other ways other than drinking alcohol. The other bit which is really important, and it's really important for people who are considering cutting down or stopping drinking altogether. So in my Working Club Soda, I support people who are actively in the process of changing their drinking. We run a free course called How to Change Your Drinking. It's a 3-day kind of exploration of your drinking habits, alcohol-free alternatives, and some kind of top tips for change. We give that away for nothing. We've got a longer, more intensive course, and that's largely where I spend my time in supporting people who are going through the big process of change. One of the things that we encourage people to do is to pay attention to their triggers for drinking. So to think about the circumstances, where you are, what times of day, who you're with, what's going on, what are the circumstances where you end up drinking more than you want to. And for so many people, it's that point of transition between the working day and the evening. You know, we feel this need, and I think it's right, and I think there's something in us that we feel this need to mark a transition point, to say this part of the day is over and there is a new thing that's happening.
Now it's relaxation time.
Exactly. And for lots of us, we've just become socially conditioned that the way that we mark that transition point is by having a drink. The challenge is, if you take drink out of the equation, that doesn't take away the fact that there's a transition point that you still need to pay attention to. So one of the things that we encourage people to do is to think about what you need at that point. What's the emotional need that you have? What does relaxation look like for you? What does unwinding, de-stressing, you know, putting work away, what does that look like for you? And then work out ways of achieving all of those things without having a drink. Ultimately, that's just about giving you better choices, you know, so that you can make that transition point without needing to open the fridge and pouring yourself a glass of wine. You can find other ways of making it. But yeah, marking that transition. I mean, I had this conversation with colleagues earlier on today. You know, in the absence of a work routine, it's really easy for work to drift into every moment of the day. And before you know it, you're working 18-hour days, 7 days a week, because, you're stuck at home and there is nothing else to do. Or on the other, you're out of a job or you're on furlough and you've got 18 hours of nothing to fill up. We're living in such weird times right now. But yeah, marking those moments of transition to go, this has been one part of the day, this is another part of the day, and finding out what you need to make that transition real. That's a really important thing that everyone should do. Whether you're cutting down drinking or not, rituals, those little rituals that we have to mark time and mark transition of time are so important. And we can, they're a part of life which, if we pay attention to them, they can add so much value.
Yeah, I think breaking that habitual cycle is so important, in that I've heard that people who want to give up smoking, they're told that the first thing you should do is cut it out at certain times. So don't do it as soon as you wake up. Don't do it straight after a meal. Don't do it before you go to bed, because so much of it is just about routine and habit.
Yeah.
That's such a big part of addiction, that if you can break that cycle of, when I sit down to dinner, I always crack open a bottle of wine, or I always crack open a can of beer. If you can get out of that habit, it's just such a good way to be able to cut down.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned earlier actually about people who have a drink without really kind of paying attention. And actually, I have to say, in my experience, most of us don't pay attention most of the time, not just to drinking, but to everything. It's part of the reason that we talk about mindfulness, and we kind of have a program which is based on that, is that actually all of us can benefit from paying attention, whether that's to drinking or to everything in life, really.
That's a perfect segue, because mindfulness was next on my list, because a lot of people who listen, they might not know exactly what it means. I mean, it's quite a trendy word at the moment, in that mindfulness is something I've heard being used more and more in sports coaching. You hear it in mental health, you hear it in even work culture and office culture. So I'd be interested to know, basically, what is mindfulness and how can it be a useful tool in combating alcoholism?
Okay, so we in Club Soda, all of our programs are based in the best available behaviour change science about what really supports people to change. And one of the things that's been demonstrated to help people change, and more importantly help people sustain change in the long term, is being mindful. And you're right, mindfulness is a buzzword that you see around on magazines and in the news. We're encouraged to be mindful, but we don't often really kind of describe what that looks like to people. So in Club Soda, we talk about mindfulness in two ways. We talk about it in terms of paying attention. So that we encourage people to pay attention to the circumstances around their drinking, to start to notice the situations in which you like a drink, and the situations in which you drink more than you want to, but just start to pay attention to those things. You can also begin to pay attention to your thoughts and feelings about drinking, so to notice when you're drinking to drown out a thought process, or to deal with an emotion, or to respond to stress, just to begin to notice those things. So there's a big part of mindfulness which is about paying attention. We also talk about, in Club Soda, we talk about mindfulness in terms of acting with intention. So to take those things that you've noticed and start to translate them into plans which can help you avoid the situations in which you drink more than you want to. So yeah, at a very basic level, we describe mindfulness as paying attention and acting with intention. Now, in kind of traditional mindfulness circles, everything that we do in Club Soda related to mindfulness gets described as an informal mindfulness practice. So it's about taking the philosophy of a mindfulness and applying it to everyday life. The other element of mindfulness, which is really important, is what gets described as formal mindfulness practice, which is around meditation, and that kind of happens, there's lots of different forms of that, but essentially meditation becomes the training ground for paying attention. At the very most basic level, people will often encounter mindfulness of breath, the idea that you sit and you just pay attention and you notice your body breathing. That's a really kind of entry level mindfulness discussion. People might have come across the Raisin Exercise, where you pay particular attention to the texture and flavour and sensation of eating a single raisin.
I had the wiggle the toes one when you're going to bed. I heard about it from a sports coach, and I'm thinking, why are you talking about wiggling my toes when, we're in the middle of a rugby pitch, smashing each other about? But I think it's so interesting about this idea of reconnecting your mind and your body to the here and now. And it can be so profound to when you do have that sort of red pill moment when you realise, actually, most of the time I am just going through the motions and my mind is elsewhere. My mind's either thinking about the future or it's thinking about the past. So when I am eating unhealthy food, or I'm having a drink, or I'm doing something that's not particularly good for me, almost I'm disguising it from myself because my mind is not present.
Yeah, I mean, at the most kind of fundamental level, mindfulness is about being present in the present moment and conscious as a deliberate act. It's deciding that what is going on right now is the thing which I'm going to pay attention to. One of the kind of the misconceptions about mindfulness is that, and it's in part because we use the word mindfulness to describe it as a state, but is that it's all about what's going on in your mind. And actually, it's really not. Mindfulness is about paying attention often to what's going on in your body. It's about paying attention to what's going on around you. It's that exercise in directing your attention deliberately in the present moment to what's happening right now. That's really at the core of both kind of formal and informal mindfulness practices. And it is amazing our ability to not do that. Very often we walk around as if our bodies are meat kind of machines which carry around this thinking brain, as if our bodies are totally unimportant, and we can have these wild flights of fancy and not actually be aware of anything that's going on in or around us. The human brain is kind of amazing, but the act of paying attention is a really important one. It is worth saying that it's hard work. It's not something that we do naturally. It's something that we need to train ourselves to do. It's in part why meditation practice is a formal meditation practice. Even if it's 5 minutes a day sitting, paying attention to your breathing, is going to start to reap benefits. Is because it helps you be better at life. It helps you pay attention to what's going on in the rest of your life. And when you talk about sports, that there are real physiological benefits of having a more mindful relationship to life generally. It lowers your stress levels. It helps you deal with problems in life in a more calm and a more assured way. It can help you sleep better. It can promote recovery. There's lots of physiological benefits to it, but for me, the most fundamental and the most important thing is that it just helps you turn up as a human being and live your life well. If you're going to do nothing else, do it for that.
Yeah, and I'd include myself in this category, in that I think a lot of people will hear words like mindfulness and meditation and kind of automatically put the defense up a little bit in terms of, I think a lot of people can be skeptical of things of this type, things to do with spirituality or any kind of self-betterment, really. I think some people are cynical of it, but I think when you realize how much of a profound effect this can have on your life, in that it's not just something for, it's not some kind of hippie activity like people think meditation is. This is something that when it's employed anywhere in sport, in your work life, you can get so much more done and you can become so much better at whatever task you're doing, that it can have such a great effect on your life and can really make you a better person.
Yeah, I think it's really important that you kind of, we don't have to buy a yoga mat. You don't need a
Yeah.
scented candle. Like the whole idea of the kind of the commodification of mindfulness, I find is really problematic because actually it's such a distraction. The kind of the Instagramification of mindfulness is such a distraction from the core of it. There's this really kind of, it's so dumb but so simple. That phrase, don't just sit there, do something.
Yeah.
Turning that on its head. Don't just do something, sit there. That's what mindfulness is. Just stop for a moment. Just sit down. You don't need to sit cross-legged on the floor. You don't need a yoga mat or a cushion or a bell or yoga pants or a scented candle. Just sit down for 5 minutes and just be with yourself. Just stop for 5 minutes and just experience your body breathing. It's the simplest thing in the world. Sit doing it on the loo if you really want to. You can literally do it anywhere. It doesn't have to be a big thing.
So I think one thing I was saying is ideas like mindfulness and meditation, they are kind of wrapped up in this idea of, like you say, yoga mats and scented candles. And I think that's something that especially can seem a bit off-putting to men. It can seem quite unmanly or emasculating, meditation, this sort of thing. But when you boil down to it, you're really talking about, this is about taking responsibility for your actions and getting control of your own life. And I think there's nothing, there's nothing unmasculine about living with intent and being in full control of your actions and living, getting the most out of your energy and out of your work.
Yeah, and in fact, if you're kind of like looking at kind of masculine ideals through history, actually, the idea of being a person who is in control of their life, who is making decisions, who is acting responsibly, for lots of human history, that's actually been an ideal that that men have lived up to. And if you see it as an extension of that, it's one of the things that I'm kind of intrigued by is the extent to which alcohol is become a part of male culture. There is, we find ourselves as men, I think, unable to make friends if we don't have a drink, unable to connect with the sports teams that we love unless we have a drink, unable to progress in the workplace unless we have a drink. There is so much about, and actually, if you kind of look kind of stereotypically, and I say this as a man with tattoos, but, if you look at this kind of, all the kind of the signifiers of masculine identity, that what do real men do? They drive motorbikes, they have tattoos, they drink whiskey. We've kind of inherited alcohol into our worldview about what being a man looks like. And of course, that is really all cultural assumption about what masculinity is and how we embody it. And it is entirely possible to live a healthy and fulfilled life as a man and not drink booze.
I think that, again, coming from a rugby background, which can be very, very masculine, I think I've definitely lived in that world where drinking is a sort of badge of honor, how much you can drink, how quickly you can drink. I know I've definitely contributed to that myself. And don't get me wrong, it's been the source of a lot of fun for me and a lot of good times, and I love being part of sports culture and part of rugby culture. I love being part of that community and that fraternity. But it's really interesting that the idea of drinking to excess is tied with masculinity, when actually, like what you said about when you think of the male archetypes and you think of male heroes, they're people who are very much in control of their life, and they're living with intent. They live morally and they work hard. And this is kind of an antithesis to drinking heavily, right? Because when you're at the mercy of alcohol, you're not getting the best out of yourself. You can't really live morally. You can't look after the people around you necessarily. So it's interesting that somehow both of those things are true at the same time. It doesn't really make much sense.
Doesn't make much sense, but to be honest, there's so much about the way in which we think about alcohol in our society that doesn't make sense. We, as you know, I talked earlier about, you've got alcoholics in one corner and then the rest of the population, as if there's a certain breed or type of person who gets into problems with drinking and everyone is basically fine. Everyone else is basically fine. That's evidently not true. But also that we take it so much for granted. Nobody actually pays attention to it or thinks about it. Some people say, alcohol is the only drug in our society that you actually have to actively decide not to consume.
Yeah, it's opt out rather than opt in.
We have an opt out culture when it comes to alcohol, which is bizarre. So we are, as a whole society, regardless of gender, we are unable to think about alcohol in a rational way. That's why, for me, mindfulness is really important, because it's starting to pay attention to the ways in which alcohol weaves itself into your personal identity, into your relationships, into your social life, into your work life, into your home life, and then starting to notice those areas of your life where it's not working and fixing them. There isn't that people talk about rock bottoms. They're very glamorous in some kind of ways. We as human beings, we are attracted to dramatic stories of recovery. We like rag to riches narratives. We like people who've been utterly broken and now are completely healed. We love that. There are so many stories in our society which play into that trope, but that's not what life is actually like. For most of us, we live lives which get to be, just kind of a little bit shitty, slightly suboptimal, and not quite what I've chosen. But we don't have to live with that. All of those things, if you spot something in your life, it doesn't have to be a disaster. If it's not working for you, get involved, pay attention and sort it out. That's, anyone can do that. You don't have to be at rock bottom.
And again, the problem with that as well is that, for maybe 100 people that hit rock bottom, you get one inspirational story where they come out the other side, they completely pull their life around, and they end up working for the better of humanity. But for every one of them, there's 99% of people that hit rock bottom and they never get any better. So this idea that you have to hit rock bottom before you can come back to the top again, I think is such a dangerous idea. It's interesting talking about drinking as a sort of marker of masculine identity, because I think one thing I've noticed living as an expat as well is that how drinking can be a marker of national identity. I have friends from kind of all over the Anglophone world, and I find especially that I share a kind of bond with Irish, Australians, South Africans, in that I feel like, well, I'm English, like I'm British, I can drink a lot. That's part of my identity. That's part of my culture, is that I can drink more than anybody else. I have banter with a lot of Americans and with Japanese people about, oh yeah, you're shit drinkers, you can't drink nearly as much as I can. And I didn't realize how much club soda had an international reach, and I was wondering how it differs from country to country, and if you find these problems in Britain more so than other places, or if different countries have alcoholism in different ways, because I feel like it is really part of the British identity, right? I feel like drinking is kind of at our core.
I think that is true. I mean, I think that's not just true for the English-speaking Anglophone world. There's a Northern European issue, particularly about beer drinking. There is a particular beer drinking culture, and we've had beer in our society for as long as we've had bread. It's basically the same process that makes both. 10,000 years of beer drinking culture is going to have shaped humanity. And when you put those people in dark, cold bits of Northern Europe, it's hardly surprising that we develop a collective drink problem, particularly in the winter. What else are you going to do when it's dry, dark, drafty and cold, other than drink this magical liquid that makes you warm? So it's totally understandable. And that's just become part of our national identity. One of the really interesting things, one of the differences that we see between British culture and American culture when it comes to drinking, and there are lots, but just kind of pick on one, is about the centrality of the pub. We have this idea in in Britain, which we spread to other bits of the English-speaking world, thanks to the Empire. Hurrah for that! Not really. We have this idea of the public house, this place in a community where people can gather, traditionally where people would transact business on market day, where families would gather for celebrations, where people could get a good meal, but where, really importantly, people could consume alcohol. We have this idea. And when we talk about the decline of the pub in modern British society, it's worth noting that 200 years ago there were villages of 500 people in this country that had 20 public houses. These places,
the glory days, I like to call it.
Yeah, but the pub has been a part of what it means to be British for generations. American culture is really different. Bars fulfill a very different role in American culture. You have the kind of the sports bar, the place where you go and there's always a game on in the background. And you have that. But basically, bars are places where people drink to get drunk.
Yeah.
That's what bars are for.
And it's the same. It's the same in Japan as well, in that you will not find anywhere to have a drink in Japan before about 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening, unless you go out to lunch, and you can obviously drink with a meal in a restaurant. But because they don't have the pub culture, like you say, bars are very much for drinking. They're only open in the evening, and you go there to get drunk. And I think the drinking is not as tied to socializing and family life as it is in the UK. So I feel like trying to break drinking habits in the UK, there is that extra barrier.
Yeah. I mean, bear in mind what I said, though. 2/3 of our drinking was already happening at home even before the pandemic hit. The pubs have been in decline. We have been seeing this generational shift away from pub culture towards at-home drinking culture. So that's already been going on. But yeah, kind of symbolically, pubs play a really important role in British society and help kind of form our idea about what, in a strange kind of way, about what being British means. We have this kind of, in some bits of society, we have this kind of idealized view of people who are rooted enough in their community that they have a place that you can go where you encounter other people in your community, where you are known. And that seems to be kind of that's pretty unique in our society. It does form a lot of our identity, and I think that's where helping pubs are evolving. Pubs are shifting towards food. They're shifting towards a broader drinks offering, which isn't just alcohol. Think about alcohol free options. In Club Soda, we are massive fans of the pub. One of the reasons for that is that one of the biggest triggers for people drinking is isolation, and if you are an at-home drinker whose drinking is getting out of hand, one of the best things that you can do for yourself is go to the pub, because other people are going to observe your drinking behaviour. You can't drink to excess. You can't drink yourself unconscious in a pub quite as easily as you can in your own living room. So actually going to the pub could help you moderate your drinking, weirdly enough. But also it's a place where you can make friends, where you can meet people. And if isolation, kind of the loneliness is one of the reasons that you're drinking more than you want to, going to the pub can be actively good for you. So in Club Soda, we're massive advocates of the pub. We would love to see pubs stay open, and more pubs open, because actually we need places where, as whole communities, whether you're drinking alcohol or not drinking alcohol, we can gather together. And in British society, that's one of the roles that pubs plays, and it's really important for both social cohesion and also for personal well-being.
Yeah, here. I absolutely love the pub, and again, I think they're a real necessary part of culture, and it's probably one of the things I miss most about the UK, actually, because nowhere else really does it quite the same. obviously you always find an Irish pub somewhere, but it's kind of tacky and overpriced and terrible. So yeah, I'm a huge defender of the pub, and I think for a lot of people, as someone who has had local, I've had a local from time to time, I think there's a lot of, we're not very good at looking after the elderly in our society, I don't think, as much as other societies do. And I met a lot of people who were, older men normally, who were, widowers, and they didn't have a lot of family around them. They didn't have a lot of friends. And the fact that they could come to the pub every day and mix with people, and people from all different backgrounds, sometimes I'd be sitting around a table and there'd be an 18-year-old kid, there'd be me, there'd be someone in their 40s, and then there'd be someone in their, 70s and 80s. And I think without the pub, there's a lot of people who would basically have no social interaction in their life. Yeah. And also, like you say, it's sort of counterintuitive that the pub would actually be an antidote to excessive drinking. But I've always been a big advocate of letting younger people in the pub, because the point that you touched on before is that your consumption is monitored, and you can't act up in a pub. The moment you get too leery or too drunk, you're going to get chucked out or you're going to get barred. And for me, growing up, if I was allowed to go in the pub, I'd go there, I'd have a few beers, but I couldn't act up. If I started, if I had too much, then I'd get a clip round the ear from the landlord. Whereas the alternative is we'd go and buy bottles of vodka and sit in the park and end up getting like paralytic drunk and, fighting, vandalizing, just general louts. And that kind of behavior is not tolerated in the pub. So in a way, I actually think younger people being able to go into the pub would actually stop them drinking as excessively. I mean, when I say young people, I'm talking like 16, 17-year-olds, not like 12-year-olds. I'm not encouraging childhood drinking here.
Yeah,
I just think if you are going to be drinking as a 17-year-old, I think it's safer that you're doing it in the pub than in the local park with £5 vodka.
Yeah, I mean, there is a real issue around teenage drinking, but that is a lot to do with what we demonstrate to teenagers as being social norms. It's very hard to grow up if you're a teenager growing up in British society. What you come to believe is that the only way that you make friends is by being drunk, and so
relationships as well. That idea that basically the only way you're going to get laid, or the only way you're going to find a girlfriend or boyfriend, is to go out and get so steaming drunk that you actually don't know. You eventually stumble into each other. And I think that's a real toxic behavior pattern as well, that how much sex and just relationships between people are dependent on being completely out of your mind and irresponsible and not in control.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are so many things that we could unpack there, but I'm always amazed at the number of people who will admit that they've never had sex with their partner sober.
Yeah.
And it is genuine. And we actually we write articles about this and run webinars and do all sorts. Sober sex becomes it becomes a stumbling block for people when they think about changing their drinking. And it's in part, we feel uncomfortable about our bodies, so being drunk kind of numbs our feelings of inadequacy about the way in which we look. But it's really important, like, let's not even get into the realm of consent, but basically you can't make good decisions about your sex life. If you cannot stand up, and particularly for teenagers, in fact for everyone, if you're going to enter into a long-term relationship with somebody, and I say this, you will do yourself a favor by making sober decisions.
Yeah, definitely. And
in every sense of the word.
And it's unfortunate. I think we all know people of my age, people that have been to university, all know people, both men and women, that have been caught up in situations that have got really messy in terms of there's been a sexual encounter and one party doesn't remember it or can't, you wake up and you don't know how you got there. And again, there's that question of what was there consent or not, and how far are you able to give consent when you're intoxicated? And it really, it's just not a healthy way to be introduced to dating and to be introduced to sex. Is basically to be like, you need to be so drunk that you can't remember, because that just opens a Pandora's box of just disaster when you mix sex. Again, it's like the masculinity, they're kind of at complete they're completely at odds with each other, really, alcohol and relationships or alcohol and sex. Yet in our culture, they're married together as if they're strawberries and cream.
Yeah, I say this to. I recently wrote an article for a drinks advice website about teenagers and drinking, and one of the things that I said to parents in that is that if your teenager comes home and they're steaming drunk, you need to deal with them as if they were sick. As if they had an illness. This is now is not the time to tell them off, to shout at them, to lose it, to ground them. They need physical care as if they were ill. And I think that's a really useful attitude for us to take into life generally. If you encounter someone who is too drunk to consent, they need to be looked after.
Yeah, exactly. And I think
they need to be cared for, because they're in a vulnerable state. They are physically unwell, and you wouldn't, if you ran across somebody who had a raging fever and was coughing their guts out, you wouldn't cop off with
grab
them.
your coat, love. You've pulled.
I know, you put them to bed, and you'd leave them there on their own. That's I don't understand why we think it's any different if people are out of their heads on booze.
And personally, I think that's as someone again who's known people who have been caught up in men that have been caught up in terrible situations where they've been accused of something because they were drunk or the other party was drunk. And I think the idea that I have, and I think the idea that's becoming more common, especially in universities, and I think it's a good thing, that basically if the other person is drunk, it is not worth the trouble. Do you know what I mean? For no matter how desperate you are, you're opening the door to just so much terrible things when you involve yourself with someone who's even kind of mildly drunk, even someone who might wake up the next day and just regret it, or someone that might think that you're a lot more attractive and a lot more interesting than you were. I think the safe thing, again, if I had kids, especially if I had boys, I think what I'd be saying to them is, look, if a girl's drunk or a boy's drunk, it's you need to be treating them as if they're, like you say, as if they're sick. And I feel like our society, we almost propagate this idea that when people are drunk, you should see opportunity with the opposite sex when they're drunk, when actually it should be the complete opposite, in that if someone is drunk, that should be your marker to say sex is off the table, basically.
Definitely. And there are other ways. There are better and more fun and totally sober ways to get your end away.
Yeah, exactly. And again, I think getting into it so young, it stops you from developing a personality to a certain extent, or even just progressing and developing your social skills and how you interact and how you talk with people. If your method of getting attention from the opposite sex is basically getting so drunk and hoping that they're so drunk that you just stumble into each other and it goes from there, that's just such a bad habit to get into when it's young. And I think that's the other problem with young drinking as well, is that for a lot of people it becomes, and I have to say again, being a rugby player at university, it does become a little bit of a personality trait. It starts off as a bit of fun and games, and then before you know it, your whole personality is based around being the guy who gets the drunkest at the party, or being the guy who can neck a pint in 2 seconds, or being the guy who can do a load, drink loads of shots or something. And I think that's a connection that's just so dangerous, is when you basically don't develop a personality, because your personality is just to drink. You're the drunk guy. And drunk people can be funny and 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 amusing, and it can be a social lubricant. But when you're so young, if all of your interactions are built on that foundation, you're just doomed in adulthood, really.
Yeah, basically you've really limited your life choices, because basically what you're saying is the only way that I'm ever going to be able to relate to other people is if I've had several pints. And then, but you're also then really limiting the number of people that you can build connections with, because essentially what you're saying is I'm only ever going to hang out with other people who are drinking. And if you look across society as a whole, most of us don't drink most of the time. This comes as a huge surprise to people when they start assessing their own drinking habits. But most people in society don't drink every day, they don't drink to excess, and they don't drink to get drunk. We have, and 20% of people in our society, 20% of adults in our society don't drink alcohol at all. There is a huge spectrum of people. If you are surrounding yourself, if all of your socializing is happening and it involves alcohol, you are at the extreme end of what drinking behavior looks like. And you're missing out on the 80% of society who don't act in the same way that you do. And they're all good people. They're just not pissed all the time.
And again, I've certainly been guilty of deriving my social confidence from alcohol, and maybe being someone who they say, after a few beers he's really good fun. And again, for some introverted people, I think that can be healthy in a way, in that some introverted people, they have a few drinks and they come out of their shell a bit. But I think to base your whole all of your confidence from drinking, and like you say, most of the interactions we do sober. So it means that you're only having fulfilling human interaction for, 5% of the time when you're at the pub or when you're at a bar. And again, you're also shutting out a whole world of people who don't socialize via drinking.
Yeah, I mean, the issue of social anxiety is real for people, and it can be absolutely crippling. And I totally understand why people use alcohol as a shortcut, because essentially what it allows you to do is it damps down your sense of anxiety. It allows you, essentially, in those situations, it allows you to forget yourself. So you become less self-aware, but you use alcohol to achieve that. But actually, there are other routes to becoming less self-aware in social situations. One of the best ways of doing it is developing good questions to ask people. If you find yourself in a social situation, and you're feeling a sense of social anxiety, spotlighting other people by asking good questions takes the spotlight off you. It can be a great way of reducing anxiety. And it's one of the things which alcohol did to you, is that it let you forget yourself, but you can lose yourself in conversation with other people. You just need a good bank of questions. So there are other ways of dealing with this. One of the other things which is really important to know about alcohol, and we've talked about it a bit in relation to anxiety just now, but we mentioned about stress and about coping earlier. One of the things which people don't know about alcohol, we all understand that alcohol has a depressant effect. That's why we get drunk and fall asleep. But we very rarely stop to consider how it is that some people drink and fall asleep, whereas other people drink and get into fights. It's the same thing that you're consuming, but it seems to have two very different effects. And that's because one of the things that alcohol does is it acts in our body as a stimulant, so as well as a depressant. It's a huge cocktail of different responses that it creates in us.
Especially when you're mixing it with bloody Red Bull.
Oh man, talk about that. So,
which is just the worst possible concoction that has ever been invented, I think.
I would suggest lager and speed is worse, but
but it's not far off. I mean, it's not far off, basically, when you think about it. And it's funny, absolutely. If you notice if you ever read a can of energy drink, the warnings is like, don't consume if you have heart problems, don't consume if you're pregnant, don't mix with alcohol. It says that on the warning sign on the can.
Yeah, absolutely. So alcohol acts as a stimulant as well as a depressant. So if you are suffering from anxiety and you are drinking to help you cope with that, you are actually making your anxiety worse overall, because you are adding adrenaline and noradrenaline and other stimulants, cortisol. You're adding those to your system as you're drinking alcohol. So yeah, finding other ways of coping with anxiety, finding other ways of relating to each other. And that's all just about, learning to talk to people, ask people questions, make it about them and not you, really kind of basic introductory how to be a human being kind of stuff. But
it's surprising how many people don't have these tools in their arsenal, because if you've always been relying on alcohol, then you don't realize that actually social interaction is something you have to work on and that you have to practice. It's not, I think people think that, I can be anxious, so I'm not good in social situations. This is just a personality trait that I am now stuck with for the rest of my life. And they don't realize that, no, it takes a hell of a lot of work and practice and thought to be someone who's, slick and charismatic in a social setting. And one thing you alluded to, which something I found really profound, the idea that drinking is just borrowing happiness from tomorrow. I heard that and thought about that for such a long time, and how true it was. And that, like you say, by using drink as a social lubricant, it's helping you in the short term. But then if it means that for the next 2 days you're going to be completely unable to leave the house or talk to anyone, overall you're making a sort of net loss in terms of your social improvement and your mental health development.
Yeah, I often say to people, although alcohol has real physiological effects on your body, it is fundamentally not magic. It doesn't turn you into somebody else. So, if you're the kind of person who only feels confident when they've had a drink, you have the capacity to be confident. You haven't turned into somebody else after a couple of drinks. You're still you. So that ability to be confident is still in you. That ability to relax is still in you, to be outgoing, to be friendly, all of those things. They are all traits and attributes that you already have. So working out how to bring those to the surface without alcohol is just going to give you more choices and more flexibility about how you approach life.
Yeah, I guess that's the $1 million question, isn't it? How do you unlock that potential? Like you say, it's in you somewhere, inside you. Everyone has the potential to be charismatic and to be the life of the party. So how do you unlock that without going via the medium of alcohol or drugs?
So for me, that starts with understanding what kind of life that you want. In Club Soda and our longer courses, we help people. We have a whole section which is centered on the idea of living the life that you imagine. And, again, the Instagramification of that, so we're not talking about van life or, that kind of like glossy image of the world. We're just saying, in the different circles of my life, what kind of person do I want to become? Who do I want to be in relation to my family? Who do I want to be in relation to my friends? How do I want to be regarded by others? All of that, together with understanding a bit about the situations where you've used alcohol, then just allows you to make maybe kind of minor changes which can get you moving in the right direction. So somebody told me this really lovely story recently about her friendships, and she was somebody who's been like everyone else affected by lockdown. She had a group gathering with her friends on a Friday night, and they used to go out for drinks on a Friday night, and she found that her drinking over Zoom, she'd watch her other friends have a glass of wine and then they'd hang up, and then she'd finish the bottle and then she'd often open another one. And it was getting too much for her and she wanted to do something about it. So what she realised in that was her friendship was really important to her. This group of people that she'd known for a long time, she wanted to stay in contact with them. It wasn't going to be okay for her to say, I'm not going to be the kind of person who doesn't have these people in my life. So she just suggested to them, rather than having our drinks on a Friday night, next weekend, could we have brunch together on Saturday?
Yeah.
And so they just shifted their socializing. So she got to be the kind of person that she wanted to be. She gets to be a person who has this group of friends that she hangs out with, and they chatted about everything. For her, that didn't involve alcohol. She didn't spend the rest of the day drinking. So she also got to be the kind of person who doesn't have a hangover on a Sunday morning. You know, it's not, we're not talking about becoming a different person. We're talking about really becoming who you are, and getting rid of the things in your life that hold you back from living the kind of life that you want. And often they're not big things. You know, they might be. I'm not saying that they might be. You know, some people will kind of wake up one day and realise, I need to change everything, you know, and some people will legitimately go down that path. But for most of us, we're talking about micro improvements. I am always really keen to encourage people to experiment and to try it out. You know, so if you're thinking about your social life, for example, if there's a group of mates that you hang out with and you always drink together, what would it be like to pitch up and not have a drink of alcohol, to take some alcohol-free beers with you instead? You're not committing to doing it forever. Just go and observe it as an experiment and see what happens and see what you can learn from it. And I guess that's the other thing which is important in all of this, is that this is about learning and experimentation. There isn't a perfect life that you can step into tomorrow, and probably it doesn't exist. What you can do, though, is you can have an idea of the person that you want to become, and you can take steps towards it and refine and improve and experiment and change things up as you go along, and just seeing how things work out.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I feel more often than not that if you did make these suggestions, they'd be welcomed by the people around you. In that, I think in a lot of cases, people probably do want to get out of their drinking habits, but they just don't know how to, or they don't want to be the first one to suggest it. Like if someone said to me, if I was in the habit of going to the pub with the same people all the time, at the same time, and someone said like, oh, instead, you know, should we go see a movie, or should we go play football, or should we just do something a little bit different? I'd be so happy. Like be, because it just breaks the monotony as well, because it's so easy to just get stuck in the same routines and the same habits, and you realize that actually, am I even enjoying this, or am I just doing this because it's what I do and it's what I have been doing for so long? And actually, that I think it just takes one person to make that suggestion of let's try something else, and I think people would buy into it.
I completely agree. I heard this really tragic story recently. A guy in his late 50s, early 60s, talking about his experience of social drinking and a group of people that he hung out with all the time in the pub. And there is, you know, particularly as you get older, men in pubs can end up drinking way more than is good for them, and it just becomes so ingrained as a way of doing social life that, you know, people are drinking to dangerous levels. Anyway, among this group of friends, one of them died from alcohol-related complications, and they did what friends do. They all went to his funeral, and then they went to the pub where he always drank. Yeah, and they started drinking together, and this guy said,
you start the cycle off again.
Yeah, and this guy said it was a wake-up call for him, because he realised after the funeral, going back to the pub, not one of them said he drank too much. It was like this thing that none of them felt able to even say anything. Yeah, you know, they were just still in it. And I think, you know, I often hear people say, if I drink, I've got this group of friends that I drink with, and I'm going to lose them as friends. And if I decide to change my drinking, they're going to not want to hang out with me. And I say, well, how do you know that? You know, they could be sitting there thinking, oh, I'm drinking far too much. And they're not saying it, and you're not saying it. And altogether, you're enabling each other to drink far more than any of you want to, because nobody will open their mouth and do the brave thing and say, this isn't working for me. Can we try something else for once? You know, and you're right, other people can respond positively. Your good friends will want you to do well in life. If you're hanging out with people who only want to get drunk with you, that probably says a lot about them, as well, but your good friends will want to support you to change, and you have to trust, to an extent, that people will do that. My own experience is I've got groups of people that I hang out with, did hang out with in pre-COVID times, who, when we go for drinks in the pub, that I've got them well trained enough now that they will ask about alcohol-free beers at the bar on my behalf. It's become a total non-issue. The first couple of times we went out, it was a bit awkward. There were some jokes, but now it's a total non-issue. And anyone can achieve that, but you just have to trust that your friends have got your back and, want the best for you.
Yeah, and it's always baffled me how people who are ordinarily very intelligent people can have such cognitive dissonance when it comes to their bad consumption habits. And I have it. I have a group of friends where people, have got into terrible states because of, whether it be gambling too much or drinking too much or eating badly or doing drugs. And everyone will suggest everything else before the root of the problem. People will go, oh yeah, he's just really unlucky that this happened, or he's going through like a bit of a bad time at the moment. And it's like, no, the problem is he's a gambling addict, so he's lost his house and his wife's left him, or he's a drug addict, so he's he's lost his job and things like that. And people are so reluctant to address the issue because I think they're concerned that it forces you to reflect upon you and your own life.
I think that's right. I think very often we don't have these conversations because there's a part of us which feels uncomfortable about what we're doing. So we think it's better to stay silent about our friends' behaviour because we know that we would hate it to have the conversation the other way around. I mean, I speak to people in my work who have got themselves in real deep difficulty with drinking, and with the people that I've spoken to about, all of them have said, I wish that somebody had spoken to me. I don't know how I would have reacted if they had, but I wish that somebody had said something, and we can be a good friend to people, I'm not talking about calling people out or embarrassing people. And I'm not even saying, have a conversation about someone's drinking. But if you notice that your friend is drinking more than they normally do, ask them how they are.
Yeah.
Ask them how work is. Very often people respond to stress or sadness or loss by drinking more. So if you spot a mate who is clearly drinking more than they normally do, ask them how they are. How have we got to this state as men that our answer to our emotional problems is the question, what can I get you, not how are you? It's such a simple thing. But if we did that more often, then we might actually save people from some of the worst excesses that end up doing them significant harm.
And sometimes people want to talk out. Sometimes people are dying to talk about their problems, but they don't want to be seen to be, unmanly or whinging. So sometimes just by asking that question allows people to then open up. And again, taking some responsibility, not just as a consumer of alcohol, but also as a friend, and realizing that you're not being a good friend by sweeping things under the rug, and you're not being a good friend. Again, no one wants preachy friends or judgmental friends, but like you say, if you notice that someone's really getting into a bad state, you're not doing them any favors by pretending it doesn't exist or enabling it.
Exactly.
So I just wanted to rewind a little bit. You touched on it a little bit earlier with the sort of how mindfulness and meditation and things like that, and just well-being in general has sort of been hijacked by things like Instagram. And I wondered what your thoughts are on sort of fad teetotalism, so things like Sober October or Dry January, because on the surface they seem like a good thing, but then I know there's studies to the contrary that say that people end up drinking more because they kind of save up, they have all of this pent up frustration or energy, and they're not actually confronting the issues when they're doing these kind of fad alcohol diets. So they just end up going twice as hard on February the 1st than they were the previous month.
Yeah, I think you've hit on something by describing it as a fad alcohol diet. You know, if your mindset is about restriction, and about avoidance and about self-denial, then it's hardly surprising that a month later you're going to want to get wasted because
Yeah.
you're not acknowledging the fact.
You're not getting to the root of it.
You're not getting to the root of it. You know, so overall, people people should be taking breaks from drinking. I use the word should advisedly. Obviously, you know, I don't want to be preachy about it, but it's a good idea if you're somebody who drinks alcohol to take regular breaks. Taking a couple of days off is brilliant. Taking longer periods off is even better. You know, these are just ways in which we can kind of mitigate some of the worst damage that alcohol can do to us. By taking regular breaks, it's a good thing. If you are somebody who is having difficulties with drinking, just doing dry January or just doing sober October isn't going to fix the problem. If essentially you take a month and all that you do is push the pause button on your drinking thinking, then the moment you take your drinking off pause again, it's going to go back to how it was.
It's just a
and you're right, it's
way.
probably going to be worse. It is. You have to do the work. You know, it can be really helpful for people who've been struggling with drinking, and particularly, and it is, you know, it's heartbreaking to watch somebody who wants to stop drinking but doesn't know how to. You know, to get yourself, if you're constantly wrestling with alcohol, it can be really hard to think clearly about it and about how you want life to be different. And for those people, you know, summoning up the courage, taking an extended break can be really helpful because it clears the decks. You know, it gives you space to think about, okay, now it's 3 days later and I'm now in my right mind. Now I've, you know, properly sobered up. What do I want life to be like? And then you can put the work into thinking about all of that kind of stuff. So for some people, it can be incredibly helpful. And, you know, taking breaks generally can be helpful. But yeah, just much like a fad diet, if you are going to, I have a problem with biscuits, right? If I'm gonna,
You're English. We all do.
I know. You know, if I'm going to avoid biscuits for a month, if I decide to myself I'm not going to eat biscuits during January, I promise you I'm going to have bought out the biscuit aisle in Tesco's in preparation for the 1st of February. You know, I understand myself well enough to that. I have to work out, in the case of biscuits, how I can eat biscuits in a moderate way.
I'm looking forward to the foundation of Club Bourbon. the offshoot of Club Soda.
That would be excellent. Very, very much needed.
I'll be your first client.
But yeah, it is that fad diet. You know, fad diets don't last, and fad diets have rebound effects. We're much better thinking about, how do I live a healthy, balanced life, which includes alcohol or doesn't include alcohol? You know, either option is open to you. But what does a good life look like? Not what does taking a month off look like? That would be a much better thing for people to do in January, I think.
Yeah, and you touched on it a little bit about how people that might want to cut down on alcohol but don't necessarily know how to. That was going to be one of my final questions is, yeah, let's say we have some listeners who, like you say, they haven't hit rock bottom, but they maybe want to start cutting down or want to start changing the way they think about alcohol, but don't want to do anything too radical. What would you say are some of the first steps you can take to going on that path?
Okay, so I'm going to, if you don't mind, plug a free course, which is Club Soda's How to Change Your Drinking. It's in 3 lessons. It will give you a complete assessment of your drinking behaviour and habits so you can understand where the problem areas are. It will introduce you to the world of alcohol-free drinks, how to make choices, how to socialise alcohol-free, and it will introduce the basics of mindful drinking. So learning to pay attention and learning to act with intention and make good plans. All of that completely free, and it comes with a Facebook group that you can join to chat to other people who are doing the program as well. It's brilliant. How to change your drinking at joinclubsoda.com. So, so just to kind of summarize the basics of it. So you're going to start by not actually changing anything. Just start to pay attention to your drinking, the habits, the patterns, the routines, the behaviours, and particularly notice the situations where you're drinking more than you want to. Where are you? What time of day is it? Who are you with? And what are you drinking? And those are going to be the places that you're going to want to pay attention to and act with intention going forward. So that's the very basic kind of minimal thing to do. It's just pay attention to your drinking habits and work out, are there situations where I'm drinking more than I want to? And then I think you're in the realm of, particularly for moderation, you're in the realm of tactics. Now, for me, I took a fairly big tactical decision, but it's one that's really kind of paid off for me, is that I did a category swap. I basically said, if I'm going to drink beer, 99% of the time that beer is going to be alcohol free. I'm going to drink alcohol, other types of alcohol, but my beer drinking, which for me has always been the majority of my drinking, is going to be alcohol free most of the time. And that has really massively reduced my alcohol consumption overall. It means that I can save my drinking for, a glass of wine with dinner with friends, or a really good bourbon, or a nightcap, because I've kind of lopped out alcohol from one area of my life. So you can make a category switch. You might decide that there are certain locations where you're not going to drink alcohol. So you could decide, I'm not going to drink at home. I'll drink if I'm out socializing with people, but I won't buy alcohol at home. That could be a kind of a location based one. People often use time, so you decide Monday through Thursday are going to be alcohol-free days. I personally think actually you're kind of worthwhile including a weekend day in that, because that very can easily turn into kind of saving up your drinks to binge drink at the weekend if you're not careful. So you might think about times of day. You might think about people. So there might be some people that if we go out, I'm going to get myself in trouble. So you might just want to rearrange your socializing with those people so that you are less likely to drink with them and do other activities instead. Other people you can hang around with completely unproblematically because alcohol isn't part of the equation. And then the other thing, and I really like this idea, one of my colleagues in Club Soda moderates her drinking according to her mood. So she just checks in with herself if she's thinking about having a drink. Am I sad? Am I angry? Am I lonely? Am I, if she's experiencing a difficult emotion, she won't have a drink. So she'll only drink when she's happy. And I think, I'm really intrigued by that. I haven't kind of pursued that as a tactic for moderation, but I think that's a really kind of interesting one to kind of respond into the moment to, what is this drink going to do for me?
I think that's really interesting.
And if this drink is a way of coping with an uncomfortable feeling, I'm not going to have the drink and I'm going to deal with the feeling instead. And I'm only going to drink at the times where I feel already happy and confident and relaxed. And, if people did that, we'd eliminate a lot of emotional drinking, which can be a real problem for people. So those are some tactics, and they really kind of center around what you've paid attention to around the situations where you're drinking more than you want to, and paying attention to how you can make micro changes to make your good decisions easier in those situations. Changing through willpower alone is just hideous. I wouldn't recommend it. But you can.
No cold turkey.
No, but you can. No, absolutely not. Yeah. And actually, by the by, and it's not by the by, if you are drinking heavily and you're drinking every day, you need to know that there is a risk of alcohol withdrawal symptoms, which can, in severe cases, be fatal. Yeah. Withdrawing from alcohol is the only drug that can kill you. Everything else is just unpleasant. So, if you are drinking every day, and particularly if you're drinking a lot every day, seek medical advice. Your doctor's going to tell you to cut down gradually over time. Never, ever, ever go cold turkey from alcohol. It's incredibly dangerous. Anyway, that's
you've touched on. Well, no, it's a very good disclaimer to add there.
Yeah.
But you touched on something that I was interested to ask you about as well, which is about addiction and how to spot addiction, and when does social drinking become dependent? in terms of you get people that I think go to the pub every day and have a few pints, or maybe couples that might drink a bottle of wine a night, that would not describe themselves as alcoholics and would not say that they are addicted to alcohol. But are there any telltale signs that this isn't just a habit, or this isn't just a social lubricant, that this is now a dependence issue?
Yeah, okay. So addiction itself is incredibly complex as a phenomenon, and it's made up of a number of different parts. So it's not just physical, it's social, it's psychological. There are all sorts of different, it's behavioural. There are all sorts of different things which go into making up an addiction. One of the things which comes as it's really helpful to do, I think, is to separate out the idea of physical dependence on alcohol from a social or psychological dependence on alcohol, because you can be drinking in ways which socially and psychologically are unproblematic to you and have become physically dependent on alcohol. So our bodies are extraordinary things in their ability to cope with and adjust to the presence of substances, and particularly alcohol. Your body, your neurochemistry changes as you drink. So your body reacts as a way of keeping you in stasis. And particularly if you're somebody who drinks every day, your body adjusts to the continual presence of alcohol. That's where tolerance starts from, so I mentioned this earlier, going from the 1 pint makes you drunk to 6 pints make you drunk, is because your body has become accustomed to the presence of alcohol. You've developed a tolerance for it. Over time, tolerance can turn into physical dependence, and essentially what that is that if you take alcohol out of the equation, your body can't react quickly enough, and all of the compensation measures that your body has put in place send your brain into haywire. So at its most extreme, if somebody's physically dependent on alcohol and they stop drinking suddenly, you can end up having seizures because your brain is compensating for something which isn't there. That's why kind of cutting down slowly is really important. But it's really important to understand that physical dependence can happen even if you identify that you don't have a problem. It can creep up on you, and particularly if you're the kind of person who is drinking every day and is drinking, say you're the kind of person who's drinking a bottle of wine every day, you're going to be on the edge of physical dependence, and depending on your physical state and other illnesses and medication and all the rest of it, you can get yourself in significant difficulty if you stop suddenly. So there's physical dependence to deal with, but then there's also the ways in which we rely on alcohol in different social and personal situations, and that bit of addiction is a lot about how we feel about ourselves, and it's a lot about the quality of our life, and the way in which we use alcohol or other drugs or anything else to make life bearable. And it's so for me, I'm really taken by the idea that addiction, it's not a personal failing, it's a product of a failing society that makes it impossible for some people to live their life without relying on substances to cope. And that makes it a whole society issue for us to address, not individuals to kind of point to individuals' moral failings in some kind of way. It's all of our issues. But for the overwhelming majority of people, I would say if you're approaching the subject of alcohol and approaching the subject of change, it's actually, don't worry about the word alcoholism. Doctors don't use it generally anyway. Don't even worry about the word addiction. This isn't what it's about. It's about understanding how you want to live, understanding the role that alcohol's played, understanding the dynamics around physical dependence and whether you may be affected by them, and then putting in a plan for change. And you might need support. Organisations like Club Soda, we're set up essentially to do that. It's what I spend my whole working life doing, is helping people make those transitions away from a life which centres on drinking. But don't don't worry about addiction. Don't worry about alcoholism. Focus on you and the kind of life that you want to live.
It's just absolutely mind-boggling to me that this isn't common knowledge for a society that has alcohol at its core, and has done for thousands of years. That these things aren't readily discussed or taught in our culture, considering that how much of our daily lives revolve around alcohol, and yet people, including myself, just have no ideas about things like addiction, the short-term, long-term risks, and the alternatives to it.
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit, until 7 years ago, I knew nothing. I'm now. If you want to have a longer conversation about brewing techniques, I'm up for that. I actually know a scary amount about how alcohol is produced in different ways.
We'll get you back on for the
round two.
But
you're right. But you're right. This is stuff, particularly about the effects of alcohol. In Club Soda, we don't talk a lot about harms. We're actually all about talking about the ways in which life can be better if you change. But you're right. The teaching that we have in schools, the conversations that we have in families, part of the problem is that we don't recognise that alcohol, as well as playing all of the roles that it does in society, is a drug, and it has complex effects on us. And some of those effects are physical, and some of those effects can be damaging. But because it's so ingrained in our society, we can't have honest conversations about booze. And that's a lot of what I spend is about educating people about what alcohol is, what it does, the upsides, the downsides. It's just that kind of like, it's just
stuff you should learn which is stuff that you should be learning when you're 12 years old. Not when you're 45 and your life's falling to bits.
Absolutely, but part of that I think comes from, and I say this as a parent of somebody in their 20s. A lot of that is about parental discomfort, that we don't want to have these conversations with our kids because they know that they reflect badly on us. Yeah. There is literally no point. If you're faced with a drunk teenager, there is no point grounding them, telling them they can go to the party, but they have to be home by 10 o'clock, and they know full well if you go to a party, you're home at 3 a.m. We stop. We don't have the conversation because we feel uncomfortable about what we're doing. And that is dumb, Sort out your own shit and then have the
grow
conversation
up
with somebody else. Exactly.
Yeah. Great. So we're coming up to 2 hours now. So I think we'll wrap it up there if that's all right.
No worries.
So before we go, just if you want to let people know where they can get hold of the book, How to Be a Mindful Drinker, and how they can get involved with Club Soda.
Yeah, so How to Be a Mindful Drinker is published by Dorling Kindersley. It came out in 2019. You can find it on Amazon. It's also an audiobook if you've got Audible. And if you do listen to the audiobook, you actually get some really lovely bonus material where Laura, my co-founder, and I interview people about how they changed their drinking, and they get to tell their story in some more detail. So yeah, do download it from Audible. Club Soda, you can find us at joinclubsoda.com. We're all over social media at Join Club Soda, and as I said earlier, we run a free course called How to Change Your Drinking. So if you're just even at the beginning of this, starting to think and explore, want to get an assessment about areas of your life in which drinking might be a problem for you, get some discounts on alcohol-free drinks, get some basic tips to change, then sign up to How to Change Your Drinking, which you can find on joinclubsoda.com.
Okay, great. Time for a beer. No, I'm just
awesome.
Kidding. Just kidding.
Make mine alcohol-free. Thanks, Harry.
Yeah. Okay, so Drew, thank you so much for joining me. And we'd love to have you on again if you're up for it.
Brilliant. Cheers. Thanks ever so much, Harry.
Yeah, great. See you soon.